Hello, YouTube. Sidekick here with a quick video talking about what else? Clouds. Because, well, it seems like the thing that everyone wants to talk about these days. Truthfully, that's because the change to the nature of clouds is by far the most obvious new feature that has come with DCS 2.7. And the effect is pretty obvious, as you may have seen for yourself already, or as you may have seen in many of the videos that have shown up on YouTube showing off the new eye candy opportunities that the clouds provide. And they sure do provide the opportunity for eye candy, let's face it. But honestly, I think there's a lot more going on in the way DCS looks than just the change in the clouds. Now, the changelog for the release, which is huge, devotes just one sentence to the new cloud system. I don't know, but there seems to be a lot going on under the hood that hasn't been discussed, at least to me. And I may very well be dreaming, but it seems to me that a lot of things about the way DCS World looks have just been affected more than the new clouds. And I assume that this is because putting the clouds in the world has meant that the developers had to revisit a lot of the ways that they do, particularly lighting and other visual interactions with the world. But we can talk about that as we go along. Let's just start with some requisite eye candy, because honestly, how could we not? For instance, take a look at this scene, flying the Golden Hawk F-86 over the snowy mountain landscape. Now, if this doesn't warm the heart of any red-blooded Canadian sim pilot, then you probably should check to see if you still have a pulse. But I mean, really, look down at the river down there. Where I come from, folks, we know about cold. And that, my friends, gives the impression of cold. But all we need is some sundogs, and the illusion would be complete. And then look up at the mountains. Look at the patches of shade and bright sunlight on the snow. That looks like what you would expect to see flying in this landscape in real weather. The valleys are deep in shadow, and the sun-facing slopes are in bright sun. Then, as we climb higher through the cloud layer, through a hole in the cloud layer, because we now have holes in the cloud layer, we emerge into the brightly lit world above the clouds, and now look at the mountains. The clouds have settled into the valleys, and the peaks wander off into the distance like icebergs poking up through a sea of clouds. It really is visually amazing and stunning in a way that DCS really hasn't been before. And it adds to immersion in a really important way because it makes the world feel more real. Or take another example, flying along the edge of the Golan Heights over the Sea of Galilee. Now, I grew up on the prairies in Canada, and for about half the year, it was a hot, dry place to be. And it was full of sharp river valleys with high-sided bluffs that look a little bit like this landscape. And it's also where I learned to fly. So I spent a lot of time looking at that landscape. And when I look down at this landscape, it feels authentic to me. The way the light falls on the cliffs, and again, the way the clouds cast shadows, the way the light interacts with the cockpit, it feels a lot more real to me than DCS did before. Now, obviously, it gives lots of opportunities to generate spectacular screenshots and video clips, but stopping at describing it that way feels to me like we're selling it short. For one thing, what has really been updated is the system of weather, not just clouds. And to some extent, that's understandable. In previous versions of DCS, when you specified the clouds you wanted, you pretty much just got clouds in any region of the sky, essentially looked like any other region. You got a set of localized clouds that filled the volume you specified in terms of a base altitude and height, and with a number of clouds that supposedly represented the degree of cloud cover you requested. Although I would defy anyone to be able to tell the difference between, say, 5/10 cloud and even up to maybe 8/10 in the old system. In the old system, clouds were either a major factor in emission because they were a complete unbroken overcast layer, or they were pretty much no factor at all. Well, not anymore. Now clouds really do look, feel, and act like, well, weather. I mean, when you walk out to your airplane, the atmosphere is strongly influenced by the cloud settings and emission. When you fly through the world, the weather changes. Even when you have relatively few clouds overall, when you are in or near them, they change the scene entirely. And they're always there, and you always notice them. And this, I think, is also much more realistic. No real pilot ever thinks about getting into a real aircraft without first checking the weather. And if you're like me, however, this was not something you typically checked either as a pilot getting into your aircraft or as a designer designing your mission in DCS. Which isn't to say that you couldn't do things with the old cloud and weather system. Some missions used it very effectively. It just took a lot of work to get a predictable effect, and so the number of people who spent the time to figure it out was pretty small. And to be fair, that's not an uncommon feature of many of the features of DCS. Experts within the community can get amazing results with the tools that DCS provides, but because it requires a lot of expertise and the effort to develop that expertise, it remains beyond the experience of a lot of players to get those kinds of results. Well, the new weather system, and I'm going to call it that because really calling it the new clouds really just doesn't do it justice. The new weather system makes it so easy to generate a realistic environment that it will be something that practically everyone uses. I think I'll end up making a video about how to use the new system in the mission editor, so I won't say that much about it here other than to say that the preset weather modes are easy to use and produce both stunningly visual and remarkably realistic effects. And they also produce effects that will almost certainly affect your gameplay. Now, this may not be so true if your main thing in DCS is flying around at Angels 20 doing the BFM thing. In that case, maybe the clouds will still mostly be eye candy. But if you're a mud-moving son of a hog, then your life is almost certain to get a bit more interesting in DCS 2.7. And that's because even very light levels of clouds produce effects that really can't be avoided. For instance, take a look at this mission. It's just our standard go up to the range bombing mission with the Su-25, but we've set the clouds to broken. And when we get out to the range, we find that even at a relatively low level, we're just a bit over 3,000 meters here, we're actually having to play hide and seek with the target in the clouds. And suddenly, what was just a standard fly up, fly around, drop your bombs, now we actually have to take the clouds into account. In a cloud condition that certainly you wouldn't think was going to have a dramatic effect on the mission. And its effect isn't dramatic, but it is there. We do have to modify the way we fly to take the clouds into account. I mean, take this example. This time we're flying the Tucano, again at the same range, but actually this time the clouds are set to scattered clouds, which normally would be barely noticeable. 3/10 clouds in DCS before, but now once again we're actually having to play a little bit of hide and seek with the clouds in order to be able to pick up the target uh, and do our run effectively. Now, there's a lot more times when there are no clouds, but there still are times when there are clouds. And when there are clouds, it's affecting the way that we fly, which again is much more realistic and immersive to my mind. But it does mean that you're going to have to get used to having clouds around if you're planning to be attacking the ground. In fact, even finding your target is likely to be a bit more of a challenge with the new clouds. Take a look at this. This is a scene from Scooters at War Part 2, flown with the new clouds. And all I've really done is replace the old scattered clouds with the new ones. Now, in the old system, finding the target was really a piece of cake. It was just there. You got close to the coast, you could find it. Now, suddenly, unless you know where to look and when to look, the clouds are actually covering the target and the coast, and you're not even exactly sure where you are. And luckily, in this example, the target reappears if you know where to look, but you definitely feel like you're sort of looking through a keyhole. And again, I think that that's much more immersive and much more realistic, and it's going to force you to fly differently. For one thing, I think everybody's going to have to get a lot more comfortable with their nav aids because it isn't going to be clear that just because you're up 10,000 feet, you're going to be able to see the airport. It could very well be covered in clouds. So I think clouds are going to make life quite a bit more interesting. In fact, if you really want to make your life interesting, look at what you can have now. When was the last time in DCS you sat in a cockpit and saw something like this? You can literally take off not only in 10/10 clouds, but reduce visibility with rain on the cockpit. And again, I mean, I feel like I'm sitting in a cockpit with rain landing on the hood. This is very immersive. I'm not sure that I want to do this every day, but it certainly adds an interesting experience that you can have in DCS. And in fact, I've already discovered that the new clouds give us some scope to learn how to use some of the systems we might not have used every day, like terrain clearance radar, which, if you're like me, you've probably experimented with it in the A4, but never really had much of a use for it. Well, here's one. Flying out of Beslan towards the mountains, I suddenly realized I don't know where they were. So I put it in terrain clearance mode, and I flipped it to profile, and lo and behold, it was a good thing I did, because I was about to fly right into the mountain. And literally, I was able to use the terrain clearance radar in exactly the way that it was intended to be used to avoid that eventuality, which frankly is not something I've ever had to do before. So I think, like I said, there's an awful lot of new things that we can do now that our world feels a lot more like the real world. I think that we'll be able to interact with it in some really interesting ways, and I think that's a really good thing. Well, as always, thanks very much for tuning in and listening to me ramble on as we looked at clouds from both sides. Now, at any rate, if you want to keep the videos coming, please like and subscribe. But for now, this is going to be Sidekick, signing off.